My name is Jonathan Labar from the Texas Bitcoin Project, and I first met Parker at the Katy Trail Ice House in 2022 at a local Dallas Bitcoin meetup. It just so happened that night there was a politician, a local politician, who had come to the Bitcoin meetup claiming to be a Bitcoiner and asking for financial support and political support. And I have never seen someone embody the spirit of don't trust, verify than Parker Lewis that night. He spent about 45 minutes one on one grilling this politician, crisscrossing sideways all about the Bitcoin thesis and protocol. He was asking him, well, what happens at the halving? What's the current block subsidy? What happens when all the Bitcoiner mined? And to his credit, this politician, he actually knew his stuff. We were all actually pretty impressed. But it makes me proud to be a part of a community of Bitcoiners like Parker, who will not only keep people honest and keep them to the truth, but hold politicians accountable. It's a preview of what's to come. So seeing it small scale, we are going to become a political force someday, and politicians will have to cater to our whims. And so I'm proud to be a part of a community like that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the lead, a former lead of, oh, before I say, Parker's lost his voice, so he's going to do his best. He's a little under the weather. We've all been out late these past few nights. Uh, but without further ado, the former lead of business development at Unchained, current lead of business development at ZapRight, author of the blog Gradually Then Suddenly, that's now become influential Bitcoin book by the same name, the man, the myth, the legend, Parker Lewis.
All right. Thanks, John. As he mentioned, I lost my voice. I sound a lot better than I did an hour ago, and we're going to give this the best go we got. So if you guys can bear with me. Closer to the mic. All right. So the name of the talk is nothing more American than Bitcoin. And the reason why I chose to give this talk is that Bitcoin's now worth over $1 trillion consistently. After the next halving, or possibly two, it will become larger than the dollar. And it's already creeping into the national conversation in some corners about whether or not Bitcoin is consistent with the interests of America, both the individual national security, and or whether or not the Bitcoin threatens America and the position of the dollar. And so I think that has already started to creep into the debate. It's only going to creep into the debate more and more, and it's important as Bitcoiners to carry the right frame as it relates to Bitcoin and its position vis-a-vis the dollar. All right, next slide. I can't see what slide you guys are on. Okay. I don't think this clicker is working.
It's my fault. Just make sure. Yeah, sorry, I'm going to get the other clicker.
Hold on.
Nope, I'm going to get you.
No clickers. All right, I'm going to keep going though. So first, because I can do most of this by heart, what do I mean by nothing's more American than Bitcoin? First, what it doesn't mean is that America has some claim to Bitcoin, or that there are not values of other countries that are embodied in Bitcoin. What it's meant to mean is that Bitcoin, in both the structure of governance and the values, is far more consistent with America than the dollar is. How we going? Okay, sorry. I'm gonna keep. See. All right. Okay, you're going. You're going. Let's get that. Let's get that clicker up here.
Forward, back.
All right. That's all right. Woo! Lost my voice, dealing with no clickers. We're going to go for it. All right. So the idea is that Bitcoin is far more consistent with both America's structure of government and its values. It's not just like a animal spirit. Bitcoin's American and let's go out and party. It's really, when you think about the actual underlying structure of it and the principles, it aligns with the founding of this country far more than the current construction of the dollar. And Bitcoiners should speak about that more loudly. All right. So for whom is this message? This is for the haters Elizabeth Warren, Brad Sherman, Boston, California, the advocates, Ted Cruz, Senator Lummis. Oftentimes, advocates fall into this trap of being an apologist for Bitcoin, where um, they will say, "Oh, but we like Bitcoin, but you know, we need the dollar. The dollar is good for national security." So this is just as much for the advocates as it is for the haters and the Bitcoiners. I just picked out the Odell, icon slash BTC Pay, because there's far fewer people that are more Bitcoiners than Odell and BTC Pay. So basically, just saying that this message is for everybody. All right. What is the Bitcoin and dollar dilemma? If Bitcoin credibly enforces its fixed supply, it is going to emerge as the global reserve currency. It is, like in my view, it's causal in its relationship. It is what logically follows. If Bitcoin does represent a finitely scarce form of money, it's going to replace all other forms of money, including the dollar. That means it's going to replace the dollar as a store of value. It means it's going to replace the dollar as a medium of exchange, and it's going to replace the dollar as a unit of account. It's going to facilitate practically all global commerce directly, not with an intermediary currency like the dollar. Um, and what it also means is that, or how I think about it, sorry, some of the formatting is off when we translated this from my slide to theirs, that the dollar is the equivalent of the fax machine vis-a-vis Bitcoin. It's the, horse and buggy. And um, it is illogical to believe that if we have this technology that is Bitcoin, that is 1,000x better at money than both the dollar and gold, that we're not going to use it for everything, and that's okay. Technologies get obsoleted. The dollar is getting obsoleted. There's a couple ideas that as people start to um, figure out Bitcoin, that there are consequences to the dollar, and realistically how America's government is both run and financed. But there are two false ideas that tend to percolate around DC, as well as people who recognize that Bitcoin is probably logically going to replace the dollar, but we probably shouldn't say that out loud. And the two ideas are somehow that the dollar is patriotic, as well as that the dollar is somehow important to national security. Uh, Both of those ideas are farcical. They are untrue. They couldn't be further from the truth. Um, on the one hand, the current version of the dollar, and I'll get to speaking about why, is an anathema to the people that founded this country. If they could fast forward to today and this world of QE and 100% centralization of the money supply, they couldn't have conceived of that world, nor would they have ever endorsed that or supported it or contemplated it in the structure of governance. The other idea is this idea of national security, where it's like, what does that actually mean? They never actually talk about the individual. And so what I have here is the icon of the National Security Agency, the deep state, and then the people. And that it's really this shift into this collectivist mindset rather than focusing on what actually makes our country great. And that all stems from first the individual and those added individuals up together being we the people. And so those two ideas, whenever somebody espouses them, just reinforce for them that they are not true. Um, when you think about the consequences of the dollar, of why the dollar is neither patriotic nor in the interest of our quote national security, which itself is a farce, is our national debt. A couple of things that come to mind. Our national debt is now something like, at this time, 34.6 trillion. It was probably over 35 trillion today, but we're adding about $1 trillion of debt every 100 days. There is nothing patriotic or American about our uh, our current in power Americans putting younger generations in debt. And then the other side of it is endless war. I remember literally walking out the door for my senior year in high school, which would have been, certainly more than 20 years ago. Um, and the Twin Towers got hit, and we've been in war ever since. And we don't declare war anymore. It's just we're bombing people in 10 different countries, and all of that is tied to the ability to print money. And so when you think about those two things of like whenever someone says this idea that it's either important to national security or it's patriotic, I reinforce for people to like it is time to start pushing back on those narratives, and then we'll talk about the positive sides about Bitcoin. Um, but first, on this idea that it was an anathema to the founding fathers, I have these quotes. And I'm going to read them because I can't. They're really important to hear. But basically, this is Alexander Hamilton, and anyone who's at the takeover already heard this. But it's a really great message because one, Alexander Hamilton is largely credited with, in certain ways, informally known as the father of the central bank. He was the person that was probably the greatest advocate for the first and second bank of the United States. Um, but even this person that was in favor of functionally a central banking apparatus was diametrically opposed to this idea of paper emissions, unbacked paper emissions. And to read the quotes, it says, so, and this is on the idea of emitting paper money that's unbacked. It is of a nature so liable to abuse, and it may be affirmed so certain of being abused, that the wisdom of the government will be shown in never trusting itself with the use of so seducing a dangerous and expedient. In times of tranquility, it might have no ill consequences. It might even be managed in a way to be productive of good. But in great and trying emergencies, there is almost a moral certainty of its becoming mischievous. The stamping of paper is an operation so much easier than the laying of taxes that a government in the practice of paper emissions would rarely fail in any such emergency to indulge itself so far in the employment of that resource to avoid as much as possible one less auspicious to present popularity. If it should even be so carried so far to be rendered an absolute bubble, it would at least be likely to be extended to a degree which would occasion an inflated and artificial state of things incompatible with the regular and prosperous course of the political economy. Like that is Alexander Hamilton to a T, describing what will happen if you give the government the power to do quantitative easing. And so this idea that the dollar is somehow patriotic and that is in our interest of national security, it is farcical. Go back to the ideas of what actually resulted in this country being founded, the fighting for independence, and and read a little bit, and you will realize that anyone that espouses those ideas um, isn't talking about the same America as you and I think about. So now, what defines and differentiates America? Oftentimes, and I recommend people go back and read the Constitution, but oftentimes when people think about what defines America, and I'll tell a quick story, but they think that it has to do with the Bill of Rights. But if you read the Constitution, does start with "we the people" and kind of that preamble, but it goes right into the structure of governance. Like the first word, Article 1, it just starts to enumerate what powers the executive branch has, what powers the legislative has, how the checks and balances work, how the separation of powers work, and that it's not really about the Bill of Rights. And there's this great talk. I recommend everybody go listen to it by Antonin Scalia, now since passed. His grandson's a Bitcoiner, runs Cathedral Mining, so we got a good one on our side. But he talks about this idea of what makes America exceptional, and he talks about when he goes and talks to law students, or did, he's since passed, that he would ask them, what makes America exceptional? What differentiates America? And he says, without fail, they will always say, you know, rights to, not have unreasonable searches and seizures, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right to bear arms. It's like it has nothing to do with that. That the thing that actually defines and differentiates America is the structure of government, and that the structure of government was gridlock by design. That there were these contradicting powers put in place to essentially prevent the centralization of power. And Anthony Scalia, he mentions, he says, every banana republic, every president for life has a Bill of Rights. The USSR before Russia had a objectively better Bill of Rights than the United States, but that it is what the founders would have called a parchment guarantee, not worth the paper that it was printed on. And that when you start to realize that what defines America is the things that we all think about in terms of our freedoms and our rights, they are really the output of the structure of government as an input, and specifically the the fact that that structure is what protects and guarantees the Bill of Rights. And this is where it gets into the fact that the paper dollar, the one that can be printed ad infinitum, is what undermines American stability because it's what undermines the structure of government. What makes us exceptional is our structure of government, and that people respect that structure and fight for it and enforce it. And the dollar undermines it. How does it undermine it? Go back to Alexander Hamilton talking about how, in a great and trying emergency, if they had the ability to do it, they would always print money rather than tax. And that the levying of taxes was the key constraint on the government. It was the key part of this separation of powers. And that the take away that constraint that you don't have to tax people to fund your operations, then you have your separation of powers are altered. The balance of powers is altered, and that you ultimately detach the consent of the government from the representative form of government. It's very different if they have to come to us and say, we need $4 trillion of your money to fund our what we want to do all around the world, versus, well, we don't have to because we have the Fed that can just print it. And that's really literally what the Fed is designed to do. So now when we think about this relative to Bitcoin, it is that Bitcoin is valuable because it is difficult to change. It is gridlock by design. I will go around talking all about how 21 million, 21 million, 21 million, and that, if Bitcoin credibly enforces its 21 million supply, Bitcoin will emerge as the global reserve currency. We won't shut up about it. Reality is it's possible to change. It's just that like 99% of all people would have to agree to it to debase their own form of money that they opted into, and no one would do that because it's not rational. But the same way that the US structure of government is possible to change, it's just by design very difficult to change. And that Bitcoin derives its value for that reason, that it's difficult to change. This idea that the 21 million supply and why it is reliable and why we can all count on it is not a simple up down vote. That's not the way that Bitcoin works. It's not the way that the US government works. It's not just not the way that, forming laws happen. It's also, not the way that ultimately our rights are protected because of the separation of powers. Like, even if you vote for a law that says we don't have freedom of speech, there's a check and balance on that. And that just like reinforcing this, that it's the structure of Bitcoin, the actual governance structure, the consensus rules. And I'll talk about this, the triumvirate, if there is one in the US, it's the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branch. If it is in Bitcoin, what I would relate it to is it's private keys first and foremost, the economic control of the network, it's mining, energy, security. It ties it to the real world. All of this secures Bitcoin, so it's not just mining. But then nodes are what provide permissionless access. Those three things, and they check the work of miners, and they broadcast Bitcoin transactions. Those three things working together are ultimately what guarantee this idea of decentralization, the idea of censorship resistance, and ultimately the 21 million fixed supply. And that when you round that all up, what Bitcoin guarantees is equal rights. That is what America is supposed to guarantee. That is what is undermined by the dollar detaching what we're currently living in from the intended structure of government. And what it provides is equal rights, not equal outcomes, right? It doesn't mean that, if Sailor has 200,000 Bitcoin and somebody has zero 0.1, it means that when you're sending a Bitcoin transaction, they are equally looked at the network and considered. And yes, does someone who have more Bitcoin, can they pay a higher fee? Sure, but it doesn't determine what is and what isn't valid within the Bitcoin network. So we think about these separation of powers: miners, nodes, private keys. What is the output of that? The output is Bitcoin is difficult to change. It's not a simple vote. It's not a democracy. Sometimes people talk about Bitcoin like there's a vote. There's no vote. There's the fixed supply is the outcome of that. So if you think about the structure of government of America, we've got the separation of power, and that guarantees the Bill of Rights, the rights that aren't subject to vote. The structure of governance in Bitcoin is what guarantees the fixed supply, the decentralization, the censorship resistance. Bitcoin would not be resistant to censorship. It wouldn't have a fixed supply if it wasn't difficult to change. And the only reason it is because of its ultimately its structure. Now, when we think about Bitcoin and the dollar head to head, and we think about which one is more American, the market structure of the dollar is a monopoly. The market structure of Bitcoin is a free market. Yes, there's a constraint. You can't create any more than 21 million, but everyone is free to use it. And we're not going to manage its value up and down for quote stability. Um, it's just out there and everyone's got to take care of themselves. There's no moral hazard, but it's a free market. How's the dollar issued? It's created out of thin air by some dude in New York clicking a button on a computer. How's Bitcoin issued? It's issued by proof of work. Um, Power being consumed all over the world, 2.8 gigawatts estimated right here in Texas. Uh, Arbitrary on one side, for work on the other side, for doing a job which is protecting the Bitcoin network, protecting the fixed supply. Access to the dollar system. What does the dollar system prioritize? Seniorage. Uh, who you are matters in the dollar system. Who you matters does not in the Bitcoin system. You might have more and you might be able to get a transaction process and you pay more, but it's equal rights. The impact of the structure, the impact of the dollar and this detaching of the ability to fund government via taxes or the requirement to, and not having that tether and being able to spend as much damn money as you want and then being able to control anything you functionally want to, um, is centralizing. Everything centralizes as a result of the centralized dollar. The healthcare system, the banking system, the food system. Everyone who can get cheaper access to the dollar can outcompete people who are smaller. And that is what causes centralization. The structure of governance of Bitcoin is what ensures decentralization. If you think about the intention of the founding fathers of this country, it was to prevent centralization of power. This is the thing that causes centralization of power. The priority, whenever someone talks about the dollar and it's, why we need it, it's a collectivist. It is literally communist in its nature. Like when they say, uh, you know, the the interest of national security. They never are talking about who. They're not talking about you or I. They're not talking about the individual. Bitcoin prioritizes the individual, recognizes that when the individual is strong, the nation or the group is, per se. Now, I say all this like this is the truth, this is the reality, but there is an inevitability of controversy. Um, People will claim they already have claimed that Bitcoin undermines American interests around the world, particularly Brad Sherman, but there are others. Brad Sherman's a congressman from California. People will fight, literally fight to infringe our rights. They already are, to hold Bitcoin. The haters will actually blame Bitcoin for the dollar's failure. All of this is predictable. And this is one of the reasons why, from a narrative perspective, we've got to control it better. Um, but the dollar is the fly in the ointment. There's this book called Democracy of the God That Failed. And first, America's not a democracy. But I think there's a lot of people disenchanted by the idea of America or a structure of government. My view of it is, hey, there's this massive fly in the ointment. It's called the dollar. It's called the centralization of the money supply. It's called all centralization, and it's undermine our structure of government. Let's do one thing first. Let's fix the money. Let's take the fly out of the ointment. Let's see where the dust settles. And then if we need to change anything, we likely will, we might likely need some new amendments to enshrine Bitcoin. But the first thing to do is take the fly out of the ointment. And that if you give these people, these lizard people, an inch, they will take a mile. They literally will. So if you start to apologize for Bitcoin, they will remember that and they will call you a liar later. So Bitcoin needs no apologies, no apology tours. Take ground, don't give ground, and stand the moral high ground. That's my message. Truth is on our side. So when I talk about the fact that Bitcoin's going to replace the dollar, that's just the reality of the world. Okay, it's happening. Yes, I want it to happen, but it's happening either way, whether I want it or not. Um, and that if that's the reality, we shouldn't have to describe a reality that's inconsistent with truth to not offend certain people. Um, and it is ultimately the road to ruin. If you come out and you say, hey, yeah, Bitcoin doesn't threaten the dollar, I'm not touching anything, but this keeps going on and off. If you start saying, yeah, Bitcoin's great, but it's, we need the dollar, it's not threatening the dollar, and then it ultimately turns out, then what? Then what are you going to say? You're not going to have the moral high ground to be like, I was telling you about this, and rather than run from that fact, I was telling you why it was a good thing. And so it's very important to reframe the narrative. And the narrative is nothing more American than Bitcoin. It's also that there's really, if you start to think about it in a non-emotional, beat your chest way, there's very little that's less American than the U.S. dollar in its current construction. There's also, in my view, nothing more important to the future of freedom and America than Bitcoin. And I'll tell this story in a bit, but it's also this idea of remembering the Alamo. Um, and so I'll round. This is my last serious slide, and then I've got a funny one to lighten the mood. Um, but it's to go forth and prosper. Think about what Bitcoin ultimately represents. Like at an atomic level, we are trading our time and real world value for information that is controlled by digital keys. And if anyone wanted to infringe our rights to do that, and at the same time that we're doing that, we're foregoing consumption. We're producing something for somebody else. We're saving for the future in the form of a digital information, UTXOs secured by digital keys. And if someone were wanted to question our right to do that, they are the, you know, they're the one who should be apologizing. But that when you realize that that is what Bitcoin is as an atomic level, at a substantive level, what that means is that we're trading our time for money, and there can be nothing un-American about that, and that there's really no ability to divorce our ability to store value in Bitcoin and our ability to freely exchange that value directly for goods and services. They are one and the same. And so what I say is save, transact, mine Bitcoin, do not ask permission. It's our inalienable right. And when you think about what unalienable means, it is not subject to society, what anybody else says, it's universal. It does not depend on these governments formed by men. And so, from the Declaration of Independence, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Right? That the rights are the output of the structure of government, and we do have inalienable rights. One of them is to be able to access the Bitcoin. It's not to have Bitcoin; it's to be able to access it, use it in any respect that we want to, and to realize that that truth is self-evident. Um, and one story that before I get to the final slide, is so William B. Travis was one of the guys who was fighting at the Alamo. And I had that comment of remembering the Alamo, which was um, he sent a letter when it was about 300 men at the Alamo surrounded by about 4,000 Mexican troops. And he said, he sent a letter, and in it, he described how the enemy had demanded a surrender, but that he had returned the demand for surrender with a cannon shot, and that the flag still proudly waved above the Alamo, and that he wouldn't retreat or surrender, and he'd die the death of a soldier, victory or death, and that to remember that William Travis was 27 years old, and he ultimately died at the Alamo, but that set the stage for Texas independence, ultimately Texas joining the United States. But when you just think about that's something that a 27-year-old is capable of. Like we can find our strength because we do have the moral high ground. We are operating with truth, and to remember the stories about things that actually are American, even though that preceded Texas joining the Union. So now to finish up. Geopolitical mimetic rhetoric. All right. This was a famous presentation. Everybody should go back and watch it. Bitblockboom 2019, 5 years ago, prior Bitcoin epic. It was by Michael Goldstein. It is The Art of Bitcoin Rhetoric, How to Meme Bitcoin to the Moon. What his message was, and this was controversial because Brian Bishop put it out, and then ultimately everyone thought that it was a very incendiary talk, but it was a really funny talk. So you should go watch it. But he talks about relentless propaganda. There is no bad news for Bitcoin. All public-facing Bitcoin propaganda should be relentlessly positive. Anchor on the most bullish position, and then specify nuance from there, and always reframe the narrative. He talked about how Vitalik Buterin came and started talking about Bitcoin maximalism as a pejorative, and then Bitcoiners grabbed it and said, "Yeah, we're maximalists." Like we're reframing that, and we're turning it into a badge of honor. And so when people come and say, Bitcoin threatens the dollar, you're like, damn right it does. Like that's how big this is. That's how great Bitcoin is. If Bitcoin wasn't threatening the dollar, what are we doing here? And so, don't let other people frame the narrative for you, especially when we're right, and especially when we're operating with the truth on our side, and in a way that is very consistent with our principles as Americans, and really everyone around the world who values freedom and the rights that we all believe that we have or should have, and that are unalienable. So with that, go watch the meme video by Bitstein. It's great, but I'll take questions for a few minutes. Any questions? Well, wait, Zach, you got a question? Yeah, so I think that kind of like I think about it's first going to be like the government in a straitjacket where they're gonna fight Bitcoin. They're gonna try to restrict rights. They're gonna do it more subversively. I think going to exchanges and trying to undermine our privacy as they already do. Um, I think that ultimately there's going to be a point where the dollar hyperinflates. It is the other side of Bitcoin adoption. It's not caused by Bitcoin, but my if you follow this logically, you can't save the same unit of value both in Bitcoin and the dollar at the same time. And if Bitcoin stores value better than the dollar over time, it's going to store value uh, on average and over time in all cases. And so there will be an ejection point where the dollar becomes more obviously volatile and Bitcoin becomes more obviously the thing of stability. And I think when that happens, then there's going to be a sudden constraint on the government's ability to spend because the currency that they're principally using to operate is not going to be effectively coordinating economic activity. And realistically, like they're not just going to let this happen. Like even though it's in our best interest as a country because it derives from the individual, it's in the best interest of the individual. Therefore, you add up enough individuals is in the best interest of our country. Um, but the people that extract power from the existing seigniorage aren't going to view the world that way. So I think that it is going to be a rapid restructuring of government spending because they're going to need Bitcoin ultimately, and that's where the rubber meets the road. Even governments that are tyrannical are going to need money that armies will take, or IRS agents will take. So, but it will constrain the government very quickly when they then have to come to us, just as they were intended to do, to ask us for our money to function as a government. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah. So the question is, kind of the threat potentially of ETFs and the centralization of Bitcoin around ETFs. I think it will be interesting. If I was, well, the ETFs have been able to accumulate more Bitcoin than I thought they would, like this early. But if we look at Bitcoin over time, and again, not perfect metrics, but like looking at the HODL waves of a 10x increase in Bitcoin basically allows or induces about 20% of the supply to change hands, which means that a 100x move translates to about 40%. That um, a 40%, 100x move in Bitcoin from now, the dollar's done. And so it's actually going to become like marginally harder for the ETFs to acquire. I don't know what the right number would be to have. I'd say probably over 50% to have any like real influence. But then even then, it's not. It's not up down 50%. Like that's not the way 50% of tax works. So I don't think they're going to be able to get enough Bitcoin for it to be a problem. It would be a problem if 20 million Bitcoin were sitting in Coinbase. If it's a couple million, like it's been higher than that in the past. And I think the greater issue is more, how much Bitcoin is in one or two, three large custodians that could theoretically collude with each other. All right, I don't see. Yeah, one more. Um, Someday, we got work to do right now. Still getting my book out there, working on Zappright, working on Bitcoin's most important thing. At some point, I'll clean up the streets of Austin, but my highest and best leverage is right here and working on Bitcoin for now. All right, I think I got to go, but Marty, one more. Oh yeah, thank you for setting me up there. So I'll be signing books right next to the hotel lobby in that room, first to your left if you're coming from the lobby, or last on the right if you're leaving the conference. So I'll be there signing my book, Gradually Then Suddenly. And then also, yeah, if you guys want to accept Bitcoin as payment for your business, you should really be thinking about it. Come talk to me or John's sitting back here, our founder and CEO. So yeah, go forth and prosper. Thank you.